Hello, I'm Kurt Lidke, Executive Director of Klamath Film, and you just watched Other Side of the Hill, a fascinating look at environmental efforts in Eastern Oregon in our Southern Shorts category for the Klamath Independent Film Festival. Joining us now are the co-producers of this film, James Parker and Juliet Grable, as well as the two stars of the film, Nick Johnson and Jim Walls. Thank you, all four of you, for taking some time out to join us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
Great being
So, how did the connection come together for James and Juliet? How did you find out about LCRI's efforts and kind of the misconceptions between Eastern Oregon and the Willamette Valley? I grew up in the Willamette Valley and I lived in Lakeview, so I feel like I've kind of straddled both sides of this conversation, but it is very much so a divided point. So, how did you hear about this, and at what point did you want to make a film about it?
Well, the film kind of was born out of this group of rural Oregon landowners, both Republican and Democrat, who were involved in some climate discussions at the state level, and they got to a point where they were really discouraged by kind of how those discussions were taking place and some of the roadblocks that they sort of continued to bump into, and wanted to do some storytelling that sort of tried to present a more nuanced understanding of what it means to be a rural Oregonian, specifically around the issue of climate change. And so, to sort of countering this very rigid, sort of monolithic definition of a rural conservative, um, and pitting that against kind of this stereotyped urban progressive. And so, Juliet is very connected to that group of landowners and is a landowner herself. And so uh, we sort of decided to team up and just go on this journey into different communities of Eastern Oregon. We didn't really have a specific plan when we started, besides wanting to go and listen and observe and just sort of see, like, first of all, is a changing landscape and changing climates impacting communities in Eastern Oregon, and then if so, sort of what are folks doing to address that?
And I would just add that it really was an open book at first. We were open to exploring all the possibilities. And we did have a lead about what was going on in Lakeview. There was a couple people in the group that knew some of the exciting renewable energy projects that were happening and knew about LCRI. So, but it was one of many possibilities out on the table. And I think pretty quickly, as we started initial conversations, and then certainly after the first trip to Lakeview, we were like, yeah, this has got to be the anchor for this film because there was just so much there.
The film really does a great job of showcasing that divide between Western and Eastern Oregon. And I feel personally split. I grew up in Eugene in the Willamette Valley. My parents were from Eastern Oregon, but they were very much so of the cliche, tree hugger crowd in the valley that exists. And then I lived in Lakeview for about 4 years as a journalist. So I know both sides of the argument very well. I got to work with both Nick and Jim on articles and showcasing everything that LCRI was doing in the region. I was really surprised when I first moved to Lake County. It was really an eye opener to get to work with Jim and see all of these what you would typically consider to be progressive issues being pushed forward, not because it was a political thing, but because it was a good thing for the economy. And that when you got beyond the arguments, that there was actually a lot of parallels, a lot of common grounds there. Now that split seems to really reflect a national political divide, but I like the way that your film shows that there's not as much of a divide as people may assume if we just sit down and talk through things and try to find some common ground. So was that really the goal of the film, to try to mend that bitter split between the state?
Yeah, I think it was, and I think that what we find often when we work through the politics and the jargon and sort of the rigid defining of each other and good versus bad and them versus us, I think we find most times that we have more in common than we do in difference. And I think, just speaking personally, like, the experience of making the film sort of was sort of a micro example of that, because coming into, I live in a city, and sort of going to Eastern Oregon was pretty it was a little frightening, and there was a lot of anxiety, and didn't know what to expect. And I came with some prejudgments just by virtue of being from the city, going to a rural place, and immediately just found a deep connection to the place, but also tremendous warmth and sort of this everyone being very welcoming and friendship. And so, despite these divides that we might have and differences in sort of how our day-to-day life might look or what we do for a living, I think at the end of the day we're all sort of interested in the same thing, and looking to to protect our livelihoods and ways of life, but also thinking about the next generations and sort of what we want to leave for our kids and their kids.
Jim and Nick, let's talk a little bit about what Lake County Resource Initiative is doing. When I first moved to Lakeview, it was early 2014, and I talked to Jim plenty. You were just kind of wrapping up the Innovation and Learning Center and Education Hub that, for the first time, was allowing kids growing up in an area that's never had a community college the ability to now take higher education classwork and also adult education. I know that's been a game changer for the region, and in the time since, there's been more game changer progress as far as solar and geothermal and all the various efforts that are being made. So, Jim, now that you see your years and years of work kind of coming to fruition, how do you feel kind of about putting Lake County on the map? I know you're a humble guy, but you've done so much to kind of bridge this gap between East and West and show that Eastern Oregon isn't as split as people may think. There's still what's good for the economy, uh, you know, comes out of some of these ideas that are thought of as, oh, it's too progressive and we'll never accept it here, right?
Okay, yeah, Kurt is true. I agree with that. I would like to say, to go back to the political realm, what I
Hmm.
think's wrong with politics today, whether Democrat or Republican, is we don't sit down and talk to each other anymore. We yell at each other, and that you never get much accomplished by yelling. You know,
Yeah.
sit down and talk your differences out. You don't have to agree at the end. That's what the forced collaborative, the LCRI, really taught me, that I could sit down with major environmental groups and leaders of those groups, and we could talk things out. And when it came to doing things to prevent forest fires, which we're seeing the results today, it hit me that why aren't we using some of that small diameter material rather than burning it in a pile, put it to make electricity or something, And so that was the kind of the start of the thinking, and the background of both industry and the environmental groups went with that. So it just made that, yeah, sitting down and talking things out. It works.
Well, I know you traveled all over for many years to try to showcase what Lake County was working on, and Lake County was really at the forefront of. I tell people all the time that Lake County is like a rural template for 21st century modern day economy, as far as the strides that were made with your help, as far as looking at renewable energies from an economical standpoint, modern day education through the Innovation and Learning Center. And now that you've had a chance to kind of step back, you're on what, your fourth or fifth retirement now. I'm sure at this point you always talked about retiring and you never could quite step away.
Well, I made
Um,
it. I just don't get paid anymore.
okay. Uh, but now that you're starting to see some of that, foundational work that you put in, that now Nick is carrying on with, like what are you seeing as far as a tangible effect, not just in Lake County, but the seeds you planted are kind of spreading beyond Lake County, right?
They are. And, in what we didn't even know in the beginning, look at Red Rock, the bio jet fuel, cellulosic jet fuel plant. We didn't even dream of anything like that. And, the mayor of Paisley, the mayor of Lakeview, the county commissioners all bought into this strategy. It was not some one individual did this. It was a whole group that bought into it. And I, I want to see it done. I want to see climate change resolved, is one of the things I'd like to see in my lifetime done. And this is one way to get there. And and I believe East and West can work, conservative and liberal can work on that and do that.
Nick, can you tell us some about, since I know Jim did so much work to kind of prep you for the role, what is LCRI up to now? We're working towards the future from the ground floor that Jim built and now building upon that.
Yeah, so like you said, we're really just building off the work that's been done in the past, and the work that I'm doing today really wouldn't have been possible without everything that Jim and my predecessors had done to get our community in a position to take the steps that we're taking now. One of the biggest things is we've expanded the Lakeview Stewardship Group or the Forest Collaborative to the entire Fremont Wainema National Forest, which is a big change, and that comes with a lot of its own growing pains, so to speak. On the renewable energy side of things, we're looking to help agricultural producers and rural small business owners adopt renewable energy systems as well as energy efficient systems. Jim focused a lot on large scale solar development, and this is still a great destination for large scale stuff. But now our focus is kind of shifting onto smaller applications for renewable energy.
I know a big part of LCRI's role is also to get outside of Lake County's borders and share what you're doing. I know Jim traveled constantly to different conferences and meeting with different politicians. Do you I know Jim got this a lot. Do you still get it where people are kind of shocked and surprised when you start talking about all the environmental things that you're doing and people go, "Wait, but you're in Eastern Oregon. People in Eastern Oregon don't do that." Is there still kind of that stigma or have we moved beyond that?
I think that stigma still exists, definitely. Yeah. The first question is, of course, where is Lakeview? And then it's in Eastern Oregon, and then it's kind of like, oh, really? Yeah, you guys are working on that kind of stuff. So yeah, but that stigma is still there for sure.
So James and Juliet, how much research went into Other Side of the Hill before you started filming?
Uh, a lot of research, but it was a sort of happening simultaneously. The research and the physical sort of exploration. You know, we would sort of go to different communities and we'd have it sort of very uh, sort of light introductions to folks, and then would get to a community and really start to dig in and understand what was going on, and then do a lot of research from that point to discover kind of where we wanted to go. Um, Juliet, sorry I cut you off.
We did quite a bit of research. We had quite a few leads that a bunch of us gathered, and that was actually a really fun part of the project, was just talking to different folks all around the state and learning about the huge array of projects that were going on, large and small, in so many different categories. We talked to folks in Hood River, we talked to folks in Grant County, talked to people in Wallowa, and unfortunately, we weren't able to include all of the projects in the film. And that was definitely, I think, one of the more difficult tasks, was trying to narrow down our focus and decide what to include. But I think I was pretty blown away by everything I was learning about, and it was quite exciting, that initial discovery phase. And so a lot of what we did, fortunately, the people in this initial group had a lot of connections, so a lot of people were able to broker introductions. So we weren't necessarily cold calling people, except for in a few cases we did. But more often than not, we had at least an introduction so that we weren't just calling someone blind.
Great. Well, and Lake County is the primary focus of the film, but it's not the only community that you visited in the film, and it sounds like you went to a lot of places that didn't make the final cut. So, what kind of responses did you get from community leaders, and how many places did you find that are looking at Lakeview and LCRI as kind of the template to try to follow?
We learned that there was actually already quite a bit of cross-pollination happening, especially among the different forest collaboratives. So while there were definitely communities that were, looking at Lake County and Wallowa County, there were also counties that were just kind of doing their own thing. There was this combination of both, I would say.
Okay, great. Uh, So there's been a lot of different efforts that have been launched over the years by LCRI. Jim, you probably have a laundry list full of different initiatives that you started and were in various forms of completion that Nick has probably picked up. Um, at what point did you kind of have to pick and choose, like, what is the focus of the other side of the hill going to be? Because if the film was just going to be about LCRI, you could have stretched it out really long ways. It didn't delve into the education side, but Jim played a huge part in that. Um, there's been a lot of little, I'm sure Nick can testify. There's 100 different projects kind of going on all at once that he has his hands in, and Jim was certainly that way too. And when he was manning the helm, so how did you kind of figure out? Okay, here's where our kind of focus is going to be within the greater veil that of all the work that LCRI does.
Well, that was probably the greatest challenge in this whole process, because there was such a diversity of projects, and each one, it was addressing sort of a major issue, and having tremendous impact. But I think at the end of the day, we really wanted to focus on kind of the mantra of LCRI, which is that we can find, there are solutions that exist right now that can benefit communities economically, that can also work towards addressing climate change, and can also benefit the social dynamic of a community. And so it doesn't have to be so either or when we talk about solutions to climate change. It doesn't have to be about what we have to give up. It can also, there's also sort of a color in this conversation that can be about, these are ways that we can improve our economy, and we can also at the same time reduce our emissions. And so those are not perfect solutions. There are, it's not necessarily going to solve the whole problem, but it's a great place to start, and they're things that we can sort of do today. And so we wanted to really highlight examples, sort of concrete details in the film of communities in Eastern Oregon that have already done these types of things, and are continuing to implement more and more, and sort of seeing the benefit in real time of those endeavors.
Okay, just quickly, I think scale was important, and we certainly wanted to showcase some of the larger solar projects and wind projects, but I think it's also important to show that these smaller scale projects can have a huge impact. For example, one of the projects that of course made it into the film was Emma going to talk to ranchers and landowners who were interested in implementing small scale or renewable energy projects on their land so that they can reduce energy use. We also looked at a micro hydro project in Wallowa County. So I would just say that scale was important in our selection process.
One of the moments that is rather infamous in Oregon history, and I think has led to this kind of east-west divide, was the huge spotted owl debate that happened in the late 80s and early 90s. I was in school when that happened, but I still remember it vividly, how much it divided people. And the end result is that it decimated, the timber industry. And Lakeview was one of those areas that, that's a town that was built on the timber industry. At one point, they had 7 sawmills operating at its peak, and now they have 1. And last I checked, the one isn't even going at full capacity these days. So, out of necessity, kind of LCRI came around to find a new direction forward to make sure that the community thrives. But Jim and Nick, I'm curious from your sides. Um, the lessons that were learned and perhaps the missteps taken from that spotted owl debate that is shown in the film, how that has helped guide your efforts going forward to try to reach a common ground rather than just clash, but to use that as an example. I know you worked extensively with things like the sage grouse debate that came up in Lake County a lot, and working with landowners to try to make sure that things didn't follow that same route as what happened with the spotted owl. Either of you want to comment as far as the lessons learned from the early 90s that are now paying dividends as far as your fruitful efforts with LCRI?
I'll start. I think, the fact that people like Rick Brown from Defenders of Wildlife and Mike Anderson from the Wilderness Society, and we had the timber company, the Collins Company was the one sawmill left, and they were forest stewardship certified. That helped them come to talk because they felt more comfortable than talking to, let's say, a major uh, industrial company, timber company. And that helped open that door. And again, it was, yeah, the spotted owl was yelling at each other. And now we got a group that wanted to sit down and talk to each other for a while. And we made some good progress in forestry that way.
Nick, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, just to reiterate what Jim said, it's all based on trust between the constituents of those groups, and that trust still exists today. And I think that's really the most valuable part of that relationship, and really allows us to make that progress because there is just that fundamental or baseline level of trust between the people in those groups.
One major effort that has been underway in Lake County that didn't get covered in the film is a facility called Red Rock. It's a, I think, 300 or 400 million dollar facility that is intended to take essentially forest waste products and ag waste products and turn it into renewable jet fuels. Potential game changer from an economic and environmental standpoint in the region. So, Nick and Jim, if you could both kind of explain, since the audience didn't get a chance to see Red Rock in the film, and I understand time restraints and there's 100 different things that you could have thrown into the film, but do either of you want to talk a little bit about Red Rock, what it is, what it will do to help out and just add on to all the other programs that were talked about in the film?
Yeah, Jim, you want me to take a stab at that, or do you want to go?
Yeah, go ahead, Nick. Yeah.
So Red Rock Biofuels is going to be using woody biomass residuals from restoration projects to generate diesel fuel, jet fuel, and then some other types of fuels as well. Um, right now, it's really going to be coming mostly from non-industrial and industrial private lands, not so much federal lands, because some regulations and policies in place don't allow for the generation of what are called renewable identification numbers for batches of biofuel taken from federal lands. But it's something that's really going to spur the restoration and stewardship economy in Lake County, and even outside of Lake County. They're going to pull in material from around 100 miles, 100-mile radius around Lakeview. But it's something that is taking essentially a waste product that had no value or no purpose, and generally was ended up just being burnt on site, and turning it into a high value end product, and reducing carbon all the way through the um, manufacturing process.
So,
And Kurt, I'll just add, it's a discussion we need to have with all our partners, with the environmental community and stuff, particularly when you talk about climate change. Rather than burning slash piles from these thinnings to prevent forest fires, why couldn't it be used in something productive like that and not have those emissions happen? And those, again, are having discussions, not yelling at each other.
yeah, it really shows that the multi-tiered efforts that are ongoing. Red Rock by itself may not be the single lone thing that changes everything, but that plus the geothermal efforts that are happening there, plus all of the forest management efforts, and all of these things put together adds up to a whole lot. Even in an area where Lake County is one of the largest counties in the state as far as square mileage, but it has one of the smallest populations. So people don't necessarily think of Lakeview and Lake County as having a huge impact, as far as environment and economics, just because of population scale. But the efforts being made combined really add up to a lot, right?
Absolutely.
Definitely. Yes.
So this would be a question for all four of you. So Juliet, why don't we start with you? What do you hope that people take away from this film?
Well, that's a great question. I hope that people take away the idea of possibility, and more than that, I hope that this film gets in front of enough people and enough kinds of people that it opens some minds, even just a little bit, even if it makes a couple of people consider that, oh, these people that I thought were one way might not be how I thought they were. And maybe they're not so different than I am. And maybe I should go outside my bubble a little more frequently. That would be my hope.
And Nick, how about you? From the person who's now helming LCRI, what do you hope that people take away from this film?
I have a tough time saying it any better than Juliet said it. She put it really well, but really just the same thing. To help people have deeper, more critical thought processes and conversations about these complex issues that we're facing as a whole. And I think this film was done in such a way that it's really going to allow that to happen. So kudos to Juliet and James and the whole production crew. Um, they did a fantastic job.
And James, as the chief filmmaker on this thing, what do you hope that people come out of it?
Well, I also echo Juliet. Yeah, I just hope that this film can serve as a little bit of a nudge to folks in population centers and legislators to listen more to the needs of rural communities, and like Jim says, to be willing to sit down and to talk. And Kendall, who was featured in the film, she said something which really resonated. Basically, that when we come down to have these tough discussions, when we sort of start in different different ends of a concept or an idea, instead of coming to the table talking about our positions or fighting over how we might achieve something, let's start the conversation from a place of acknowledging that the future that we envision uh, is quite similar, and that once we find that common ground, then we can start to build from there and figure out the best way that's going to sort of compromise and take into account everyone's needs. But yeah, and then one last thing, I also would just hope that people, folks in other rural communities, be it in Oregon or elsewhere, can see the example of what's happening in Lakeview, in Wallowa County, in Sherman County, in John Day, and can be inspired, to think about implementing some of these strategies in their hometown, and finding ways to balance the ecological health, the economic health, and also the social health of a community. So there really are a lot of exciting things that can be done now.
And Mr. Walls, the floor is yours if there's anything that you would like to say about this film.
Well, Juliet and James and Nick all said it very well. I will say one of the key components as we move forward with the common grounds that we find is monitoring. We don't have all the answers. And if you do scientific monitoring of what you're doing, and then you got the data to either correct or change or go forward with that works. And it's doing that builds the trust also, and keeping the trust. And, so I think that addition to how things work is to always be monitoring scientifically what you're doing, and where you're succeeding and where you're not, because you learn from failures too.
Well, thank you, Nick and Jim and James and Juliet, for your work on this important film, and Nick and Jim for the years of effort you've been putting in to make impactful environmental change in Eastern Oregon and statewide and even beyond. And thank you so much for making this very important film. I hope that if nothing else, this film sparks a dialogue, that it brings out a lot of conversations. And in addition to being available online all weekend long via Eventive, people can catch Other Side of the Hill in person at the Ross Raglan Theater here in Klamath Falls on Sunday, September 20th, around 12:50 p.m. for the 8th annual Klamath Independent Film Festival. Thank you so much, everyone, for your involvement in this film and for taking some time out to talk to us about it. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank
Kurt.
you, Kurt.